welcome everybody to another developer interview here for the Perceptive podcast series on game wisdom. My guest tonight is both has done game dev as well as work on pen and paper games as well, and they're on to discuss about the challenges of doing narrative, character design, and more. So please welcome from Hardy Roach Games, Laurence. How are you doing?
Hello there. Yeah, I'm doing good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
hmm For the people listening to us right now, we're dealing with once again the lovely challenge of time zones. As Lawrence is, I think, 5 hours ahead of me, and I am recording this at
Yep.
a very unfortunately warm 6:30 in the morning my time. So we'll be keeping things relatively brisk before I collapse on my keyboard. Although I think the audience has been wanting to see me do that at some point. So who knows if this will be the time. But it is a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for reaching out. As I was telling Lawrence, and for those of you listening, if you know or if you're interested in coming on to talk about game dev or a project you're working on, be sure to get in touch, as I'm always looking for guests for the series. So, since this is your first time on the cast, as I always start with, can you discuss a little bit about who you are and what is your background when it comes to game dev?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'm Laurence Phillips. I've been working in game design and writing spaces for, I guess, about 9 years now. So I started I actually started in TTRPGs where I worked on the game Legacy: Life Among the Ruins, which is by a very good friend of mine from university, Minerva McJander, who is currently with then were had their own thing called UFO Press, and now they're part of Roanoke and Deckard, and they might know them from Void Heart Symphony and as their most recent project, the Volume Two, I think the second edition of that game. Yeah, and then I did a lot of writing for games media, so places like websites like PC Games N and magazines like Games Master UK, while that still existed, RIP. And then I moved into working on games directly, video games directly with on a mobile game called Sunshine Days, and then later a game called Vampire Survivors, which did very well and won a couple of BAFTAs, which I think I'm one of those people where I probably peaked just in general in my career in that I've accepted a BAFTA, which if you're British is a big deal. If you're not British, you probably like what's a BAFTA. But yes. Yeah, and now I'm back working on TTRPGs. I've worked on other people's TTRPGs as well. I've worked on the game Spire for Roanoke and Deckard, Hardwired Island for Weird Age Games, the Old World TTRPG for Cubicle 7 and Games Workshop. And yeah, now I'm working on my first big solo project with my own company, Hardy Roach Games, called Giallo. Uh, well, it's not called Giallo, is it? You get the name of my own project right, but no, it's called Il Fantasma del Giallo, the Phantom of the Yellow. I just called it Giallo because that was its original working title, and that's what I refer to it to people when I'm talking about it, like in a development context. I just call it Giallo, but no, it's called Il Fantasma del Giallo, which is a narrativist, neo noir, kind of metatextual TTRPG, which is all about kind of identity and forgiveness and redemption and doing horrible things and not being forgiven, but maybe learning to live with yourself.
I'm glad that you pronounced the name of it because I'm sure my tongue would butcher it, especially working at 6:30 in the morning
I
here.
so there's a funny story about that because I always just pronounced it in my Englishman accent as Giallo, Giallo. And I got married a couple of months ago, and the caterer was a wonderful London restaurant called Vegan Yes, which is Italian Korean fusion cooking, vegan food, which is amazing if you're in London. Vegan Yes on Brick Lane. And I was chatting to the Italian chef there, owner, about this game, just because I thought you might have some insight being Italian. And I said, "Oh yeah, it's called Il Fantasma del Giallo." And he went, "No, no, 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 Giallo, Giallo." And I was like, "Right, thank you. I'm going to remember that. I might butcher everything else, but that I'll remember."
Nice. So, we'll talk a little bit more about the game in a few minutes, but what kind of attracted you to writing tabletops or tabletop RPGs? That's kind of like what you want to do with game dev.
Well, to be honest, it's just something I've been doing since I was very young. I've been doing it for over 20 years, like playing TTRPGs. I was always loved being creative within that space. Like when I was always the perennial GM for my entire life, and I always liked being creative with it. I very rarely enjoyed just kind of running games by the book or running settings by the book. I would always come up with something. And I think as I got increasingly into a broader scope of TTRPGs, which thankfully for me happened quite early, um, I kind of realized the amount of flexibility that's within that design space, because there's really the only constraints on it are what you can effectively communicate to players and like what works fundamentally. And that's way less restrictive than like the game dev requirements of like a video game where you're dealing with a lot of technical and financial problems as well. Obviously you have those in tabletop games, but fundamentally, as long as you can communicate a concept and it's understandable and playable, then you can do a lot of really interesting creative stuff with TTRPG mechanics, because you're just playing in, the phrase of the magic circle. You're just in the magic circle. There's nothing else in the circle but you and your brain. So it's just very freeing, and it's just an area where I feel comfortable and I'm very enthusiastic about what people have done and what they continue to do in this space, and it's very inspiring to continue doing it. And I'm a writer fundamentally. I have bits and bobs of other technical skills, but writing is my bread and butter, and it's what allows me to have the most freedom and creativity within a design space.
Mhm. Yep. And as we were just talking before we started the recording, um, one of your friends was a previous guest on the cast. He went by,
Mm-hmm.
of course, the name Innocent Goblin. And if I can
Yeah,
find
yeah.
the recording to that, I'll post that in the notes down so people can listen to that one as well. And I do remember discussing with him about kind of like what was so appealing to tabletop RPGs and kind of like the pen and paper side of things. And
Mm.
I guess as a somewhat of a related question regarding that, as you said, like you've been doing this now for quite a long time in terms of like writing in both game journalism, doing writing in games, and
Yeah.
writing for yourself. In the kind of like tabletop RPG space, I guess how has things changed since you started to like what you're doing right now?
I'd say it's like it's changed in a few ways. I mean, one thing is it's so much more of a crowded pond now than it was in like 2017. I think the 2017 to kind of 2020 vibes was kind of like the golden era for, not for quality of projects necessarily, like not that they weren't good, but before, like the market was very rich then, in that there weren't that many projects, but there were a lot of people willing to go for them. And I think as of now, kind of Kickstarter, the amounts that people back Kickstarters is kind of, it's from what I understand, I haven't looked at the stats in a while, but I think it's kind of gone up in kind of absolute terms, but in relativistic terms compared to the number of projects, it's like down, right? And like it's a fairly consistent thing among my peers that they're like a Kickstarter that in like 2020 would have netted them like 120 grand is now netting them like 60 grand or whatever, which is still like by any reasonable expectations like a success, but it's still a very different, it's a different ecosystem, and I think that's changing how people are pitching games, how people are writing them, how people are creating them. And like it's a good thing ultimately that there's more projects around. Like people are being more creative and engaging in the space a lot more. Like TTRPGs have skyrocketed in the last like 8 years or so, or 6 years. Like it's especially over the pandemic. But I think that the thing about that is that it's always been a problem in TTRPGs that D&D is the elephant in the room, and it sucks up all the attention. And I think that's honestly, from my perspective, kind of got worse in some ways, because the ways that people have been brought into TTRPGs is through, like actual plays like Critical Role, and through like popular media, which when it talks about TTRPGs, it will talk about D&D. So I think it's an interesting one, because I think there's a lot of people in the space. There's a lot of people doing really creative stuff in the space. There's a lot of stuff that is like D&D settings and D&D reskins and things like that. And that's gonna just suck up a lot of attention, right? And like I try not to be kind of, as someone who just doesn't particularly care for D&D and who thinks that net it's having a bit of a negative effect on. I mean, it's hard to measure these things, right? But I think it's hard as an indie developer not to have a bit of resentment there. But like, just even aside from that, economically, it creates a different incentive set. Um, but having said that, this has always been a problem in TTRPGs. It is not a new problem in TTRPGs, and in many ways, it's just exacerbated because there's more people in the space, and more people in the space is good ultimately. Like, so yeah, it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag, but it. I think now you, I think people now are. I think there's a bigger dedicated market that's willing to take a risk on something strange. Um, but I think maybe the like upper cap for how much that project can kind of do is maybe lower than it was, just because of the density of projects around. But this is mostly off the dome anecdotal, so like you probably want to go to do some stat crunching to work out if I'm full of crap or not.
And I guess like from a design standpoint, like this is definitely one of those aspects that's out of my wheelhouse as someone who focuses on more video games and of course, digital titles. But
Mm.
from a design standpoint, I mean just like creating, has there been like major changes in terms of like what people expect, either like gameplay wise or narrative wise from a tabletop RPG?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing that is good is I think that while I think it's fairly, it's still the case that most people who play TTRPGs just play D&D. I think the people who don't just play D&D are aware of way more systems than they were before, and I think also more there's more freedom within the space to kind of devise new systems and come up with them. But like, in terms of like design challenges, there's a fundamental difference, right? In the When you sit down and you make a video game, you don't have to incentivize the player to engage with the systems that you built in terms of abiding by them. You do have to engage the player to keep them playing the game. If the system is not engaging, they'll just play something else. But you don't need to engage them, or in such a way that they're going to go, oh well, like you take like Super Mario, right? To make someone play a Mario game, the levels need to be fun and engaging and understandable, and have like an appropriate difficulty curve and stuff. But you don't have to build it into the system to make the player not fall through blocks, because they'll always not fall through blocks. You don't have to keep within the foundational boundaries of the system. You don't have to play with the player's psychology to make them abide by those rules. They just will. They might not keep playing it if it's not fun, but they'll abide by those rules because they can't do otherwise unless they like literally hack the game. That's not the case in TTRPGs. In TTRPGs, a system can like take like a lot of people will talk about, let's say, like we could talk about D&D, but like let's say what's a system that's like, I mean, D&D is just the easy example, so let's just stick with that. I promise it's not, this isn't a figure of resentment, it's just an easy standby. If You often hear from people where they'll be like, oh yeah, in my D&D group we're doing like a early modern courtly drama game, right? And you might ask, that's interesting because the game systems are built for combat and it's not really modeling social interactions. and they'll say, "Oh yes, well we're ignoring this rule and this rule and this rule, and we've added this rule and this rule and this rule." Right? So there, and you'll have groups where people play games for years with just like a laundry list of house rules that they just don't like. And for me, as a designer, if any player tells me that, if I find out that a player is doing that with one of my games, I failed. Fundamentally, I failed because my job is to build a system that delivers the experience that I wanted to deliver within the boundaries that I want it to deliver it. And if they're hacking it, it's not a failure from their perspective. Like they're having fun with the game, and it's fine. There's no negativity there. But if people are playing my game with the rules that I wrote, then I know that I've communicated them well. They do what I want them to do. They're understandable. They flow nicely. Like that's what I want. People shouldn't have to do otherwise. So I think that's like a fundamental disconnect in terms of like game dev and TTR, like video game dev and TTRPG dev. Um, and the other thing as well is that you're not technically limited within a TTRPG. So it's if everything becomes systems design on like a foundational level. Like if you think about how video games incentivize play, that's like a foundational part of video game design that a lot of other things are built on. Like that foundation needs to be there, but a lot of other stuff adds onto it. Like take Vampire Survivors, the fundamental flow of gameplay needs to be in there and needs to be engaging. But if the game was just like a square on like an empty white screen with other squares, and there were no effects or sound effects or graphics or whatever, it wouldn't be as engaging. Because a lot of Vampire Survivors in particular relied on, I mean, a lot of it's kind of visual and like sound design is kind of driven by like gambling machines. Like this isn't a secret. It's
Mhm.
like a lot of the people who worked on Vampire Survivors were previously working for a company that made gambling games. So it's about creating that kind of feedback loop of positive reinforcement through graphics and sound. You can't do that in TTRPGs because so much of the environment of play and the aesthetics of play is down to like how individual people are playing it in their room or whatever. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it also gives you a lot of creative freedom because it really gets you down to the foundations of thinking about player psychology and player behavior. And there's something really uniquely invigorating about playtesting it or having someone else playtest it and having it work out exactly how you wanted it to work out.
And with kind of like, as you're describing, kind of like creating the rules for a
Mm,
tabletop game, with like creating like games again, like you've been of course citing Dungeons and Dragons as of course like one of the most popular and well-known examples. With
the most easily.
with like thinking about creating like new or original like rules for your games. I guess like again when we talk about from a game design perspective, we can look at games that can do anything by breaking the rules of the genre. Of course, like Vampire Survivors being the game that,
Mm,
and as a very interesting point, I just heard today as we're recording this that they've officially declared the whole subgenre Bullet Heaven. Like that is now the official name
yeah.
for it on Steam. So that will be what we'll be talking about for the next who knows. But
Mm.
you can see how developers can break genres or break mechanics into their own things. From a tabletop perspective, again, is with these being so much focused on writing and narrative, I guess how does that or does that get approached in a way like when you're designing a tabletop rules or its systems?
It's an interesting question, right? Because I think something about video games is that they've become like just by the nature of the development of the industry, they've become very kind of stratified into these kind of very rigid genres. So there's a lot of genre conventions and systems and design conventions that you can get a lot of hay out of by, breaking a rule, like that hasn't been broken or hasn't been broken in this combination of ways. And I think it's a bit harder in TTRPGs because I think I think it's just evolved in a different way because like the or like TTRPGs have a deeper origin than is generally ascribed to them. Like a lot of people, like, well, Gary Gygax created Dungeons and Dragons in 1966, and like then the genre was born. No, not really. Like role playing as a form of like fun,
Hmm.
creative social enterprise dates back to like the 19th century. It was like Victorian parlor games, which were largely played by women, by the way. Like it's very much something that like this experience of essentially freeform narrative play is very old, right? So, but what Dungeons and Dragons did is it kind of codified it into a kind of rigid set of rules. And I do think that the early blossoming of different kinds of TTRPGs came out of people either breaking rules that D&D set up or reintroducing role-playing conventions that D&D didn't use, or indeed bring cross-pollinating with, you know, theater and freeform theater and improv and all kinds of different things. But I think the state that the TTRPGs are in now is you don't really have like I don't really see like hard genres in TTRPGs in the same way that in video games you'll have like a shoot 'em up and a beat 'em up and a fighting game and a first person shooter. Don't you really have that. You've got instead broad philosophical ideas, right? You've got like old school play, I guess you call it, which is like very kind of very board gamey in its origins, like very combat based, very miniatures wargaming inspired. So that's your D&Ds, your Pathfinders, your old school Renaissance games of various kinds. And then you've kind of got you got what they called story games, which I'm going to be honest, I personally really struggle to distinguish between story games and narrativist games and character games. But like the broad idea is like story games are like more about freeform narrative in terms of building a story from beginning to end point, rather than you're living in the life of a character, um, like and making decisions in real time. Instead, it's kind of building like a complete story. Um, but then, like how the systems are designed in those relative games varies wildly, and then there's like the gray areas between games, you know. So it's really hard, and I think ultimately, personally, I'm less inspired by breaking rules of established genres and more by adapting ideas from specific games. Like so about my game a bit, it uses like a playing card system, which is not commonly used in TTRPGs for the simple reason that it's a ball ache, because the probability curves are really difficult to compute. So I'm kind of making a game where the probability curves being precise don't matter as much. It's my kind of solution to that. But a lot of the bones of the system were inspired by one of my favorite games called Dogs in the Vineyard, um, which is a kind of narrativist game that uses as its resolution system a sort of abstraction of poker using pools of, pardon me, I'm about to burp, pardon, uses pools of dice to abstract the concept of like poker hands. So in a res combat resolution, let's say, or even a conversation, you roll your pool of dice and then you pair them up based on pairs. I'm probably going to get this wrong because I don't have it in front of me. But basically you use pairs of dice to kind of cancel out each other's pairs. So you make bids with like duplicate results, and then you can cancel out those results with others. And how well you're able to cancel them out depends on like how it goes. So like, you know, um like if you cancel like, I'm not going to try and remember it, but it's something like, if you cancel a result using twos, then like that's like, if you can't match the number, then that's kind of a failure. And if you can match the number, you're going to get one of it. And I thought about, can I take that idea of gambling, taking a gambling mechanic and abstract it back into cards, basically, because I like cards. I just think they're fun things to handle.
Mhm.
Like there's a reason why I just carry a deck of cards around to fiddle with because I just like them. Um, but um, so basically, I was like, okay, well, let's take that and let's use the basis, or let's use a different card game as the basis of a mechanic. So here I use bridge or hearts or any other like trick taking game. So I was like, okay, let's work back from here. How can we create and then also I had the concept in mind, so kind of working concert here. How is this mechanic appropriate to the kind of narratives I want to tell? Like that's an important thing. Like, and sometimes the idea for the system comes first, sometimes the idea for the narrative comes first, but they always have to work together. So this is a game in which things can be very all or nothing. You can be alive and then you're murdered because it's based on a genre which is very based on shock value, very based on high emotion, and twists and turns. And that's a very all or nothing thing. So that's one of the reasons why I landed on like bridge, because it's you're playing a hand, um, and if you win it, then you take the tricks, right? And it's very all or nothing. You get it, they get nothing. Obviously, it can't quite be that all or nothing for like play reasons, but that's a good starting point, you know. Um, so yeah, so like that's how I personally approach interacting with like the legacy of TTRPGs. Is I look at what excites me, what works in other games, what they use it for, and I think about what I can do that's maybe capturing a similar feel or an adjacent feeling or experience with a concept that I.
Hmm. And with the idea of kind of like trying to meld like the narrative and the actual like game design, the gameplay together,
Hmm.
as you're talking about like using like different elements like poker cards, dice, and so on, I guess like when we talk about from a game design perspective, we can talk about how different genre mechanics can be interpreted or used in different ways. But from a tabletop perspective, I guess like when you're sitting there thinking about like your game, like how do you think about things in terms of do I want this represented through cards, through dice, through some
Hmm.
other medium?
Well, it's a hard one to kind of put in absolute terms because it's one of those things that's a very kind of vibey
Mm-hmm.
thing. And like for me, it's just what it feels like and how well that translates. Like essentially, tabletop game design, and I think video game design, but in video game design, I think it's just as important in TTRPG design. But the problem is that that importance can be, what's the word, uh hidden or obscured by everything that lies on top of that foundational design. And I think it's how you get games where people, let's say someone's making a poster pop game, and the art is just right, the music is just right, the animation is just right. It's all like in terms of vibes and everything, it's nailed it, right? But people play it and they're like, yeah, it just doesn't feel right, And I think the problem is you get designers in video games and in TTRPGs who they just see a system that works for something, and they're just like, well, it works for that, so I'll just kind of change this little bits about it, and it'll work for this too. But you can't really get rid of that essential like feeling. And like an example is, I mean, I the my one pages I wrote quite a number of years ago when I was kind of inspired to do one pages, and that kind of inspiration faded, and also I ended up getting a regular job in other places that took up more of my time. But something that was fun to think about in that is like what mechanics kind of represent can create that feeling. Like for one game, it's just a silly game that's all about blowing stuff up, and you're like a sort of post-apoc sci-fi gang that just love blowing stuff up. That's their whole thing, and they're all about blowing stuff up. So I was like, okay, well, what can I do with that? Well, you need to be able to roll a lot of dice because that's like the fun. And someone else actually, Tanya Floker, who is a fantastic designer, is is doing a game called the Thunder Perfect Mind, which kind of is aiming for this kind of very frenetic kind of fast, hard action kind of vibes, and they're also using like big dice. It's also using like big dice pools, right? Because there's something just like it's the same reason why it's fun in Warhammer. You're just like, oh, all these bullets, firing them, boom, right? And whoops, I knocked something off my desk, and it fell on a load of stuff. I've got too enthusiastic, but like, yeah, and also like I also building the exploding dice, which is like obviously like it's a game about exploding dice. So basically, when you roll the max value of the dice, you roll it again. So it's that feeling of escalation of like big things happening, lots of things happening. You're just doing this, and it's escalating, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's fun. Whereas if you're playing, let's say, like a gritty resource heavy, like a resource management kind of, let's say, post-apoc TTRPG, you don't want to do that because it's excess, it's excitement, it's big. You know, something like, I mean, I've seen games that do a thing where the players actually have like a shared dice pool in the middle of the table, and you can take dice from it to achieve things, but you don't get them back, and now other people can't use them. So there's that really strong, you're sharing a resource, you're trying to use as little of that resource as you can to achieve something so you don't screw over everyone else. That's post-apoc, that's community building, that's survival. You know, and it's about what how can we abstract this into game mechanics, basically. Um and I realize I've rambled, this always happens to me. I rambled so long I've forgotten what the question even was. But I hope I answered the question somewhere in there, and if I didn't, you can say.
All right. And like with the idea of kind of like the vibe or like the feel of like your
Mm,
narrative and how that merges with the gameplay. I guess like as the example of like if you're trying to be something that's a more somber or more like more like I guess like realistic or like less excitement, you're not going to have a tabletop game that's about throwing 50 dice to make a decision.
mm,
So with the game that you're working on right now being more kind of like a horror or like murder mystery angle to it, I was
mm,
like,
mm.
how are the mechanics kind of like working for that one?
Well, so something. Sorry, my creaking chair. Um, so something that's really important about Il Fantasma del Giallo is in its earliest stages, it didn't have this kind of metatextual aspect. It was more of like a, I guess, like pocket dimension kind of game, you know, where you're playing a character and you're operating within this narrative. But the thing is, when you're looking to evoke a particular form of narrative, then you can't rely on the players being familiar with that form, and therefore you can't rely on the players abiding by that form. And this is a consistent problem in horror RPGs. I don't know if you've run a horror RPG, but a consistent problem in horror RPGs is how to make the person go into that room, right? Like in a film, the person goes, the person, the scared teenager, they go into that room where they think the killer might be because that's the film. Like this is the trope of the genre. And while you might say, well, in real life, I'd run out of the room and run off and call the player, do something else. They don't, and you know, in a good horror film, they don't for good reasons. But foundationally, they have to. This is how the genre works. And I think engaging with narrative in this way is something that a lot of people aren't used to doing. And you can kind of tell that by the number of people who engage with big established worlds or stories as if they're realities, right? Like I actually just recently, occasionally I amuse myself by looking up like videos of just really bad like takes on YouTube, right? Because I just find it kind of entertaining. And Games Workshop just released the model of the character Caiaphas Cain from their series of novels. Now, Caiaphas Cain is kind of like a Flashman slash Blackadder kind of figure who's like a coward, but everyone thinks he's a hero because he keeps accidentally doing heroic things, right? And there was this video saying Kaivis Kane is the worst character and he ruins 40k. And their reasoning was he breaks the scaling of the world. Like a normal human, should never be able to defeat a greater demon, right? And
Mhm.
like he's able to do things like make peace treaties with the Tau and fight off whole armies on his own. He's just a commissar. That their stat line is this. And what they've done is they've mistaken this narrative setting for a pocket dimension that actually exists and has consistent rules. And there's a particular telling line where they say, is 40k really just whatever a writer needs it to be? Yes, correct. That is what it is. Now you get complications in these large genres, like these large worlds, right? Like 40k, like Marvel, like Star Wars, because they are one property, but they exist. I keep knocking stuff off my desk. They exist across multiple genres, and those genres have different narrative tropes. So it means that what happens in one thing, what happens in The Mandalorian, might not make sense in the context of Andor. What happens in Caiaphas Cain might not make sense in the context of Eisenhorn. Like, but the problem, so what I'm getting to with all this is that I'm inspired by a few genres in this game, and they are the principal one, of course, is the giallo genre, which is a non-Italian, what non-Italians call the 60s and 70s oeuvre of thrillers, murder mysteries, crime films, horror films coming out of Italy. The general distinction is if it's not supernatural and it's to do with some kind of criminal enterprise or whatever, it's a giallo film. If it does involve the supernatural, you wouldn't call it that. Like a lot of people call Suspiria a giallo film. I wouldn't, because it's witchy. It's too witchy. But that's just semiotics. So it doesn't matter, right? But the point is, this is a genre that most people aren't familiar with. It has genre tropes that most people aren't familiar with, or rather, they are familiar with them, but just in a different context. Because ultimately, they're kind of they've got their bones in like Hitchcock films and horror films and all kinds of things. So people are familiar with them. But what you're doing through building the system is giving people the mechanical language to engage with this without even thinking that they're doing that. So the answer to the question ultimately, right, is the system is designed to make engaging with the conventions of the genre seamless. So people don't even think that that's what they're doing. They're just playing the game.
Mhm.
Um, and I think one of the things that's been frustrating for me as a designer when I've talked to people about this is more than once I've talked to people about this game, and the response I've had is, "Well, I've never seen one of those films, so it's not for me." And I think that's a shit, and I think it's just a fundamental disconnect to how I think about games, because when I
Mhm.
see a game that's about something I don't know about, and its mechanics are really good at teaching you about it, that's my favorite thing in the world. Some of my favorite games are games that teach me stuff about stuff I don't know about, and I don't need to read the lore or read a textbook. I just play it and I'm doing it. That's wonderful. Like that's what game design should do in my mind is give you the guardrails for doing a thing that you don't know about or couldn't do normally. So originally, the game didn't have this metatextual aspect. And I realized that it was really hard for me to teach players to engage with it properly while having them behave in this setting as individual people, like thinking about it as individual people. So, what I essentially needed to do is depersonalize the process of thinking about your character, which is why there's this two-layered thing where you're not just playing your character, you're also playing the actor playing the character,
Mhm.
and you're encouraged to engage with the world in a way where you have control not just over you and what you do, but over the lighting, the camera angles, the setting, the props, the content, even what's happening to other characters. Like that is a rule I'm breaking, actually, to go back to your earlier question. A rule I am breaking, or at least bending, is this idea that's very well established in TTRPGs. The player has ultimate authority over what they do, and no other players have authority over what they do. And this conversation is often discussed using the words like consent, which isn't inaccurate, but I also find it something of a it's something of a dampener on constructive conversation about it, because the word consent is so wrapped up in like really important issues to do with like sexual assault and other really important things, that I think talking about it in terms of like player consent in game design is we're putting it in terms that are going to set people off, right? And
Mhm.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, and I also don't think it's a thing. I think we're often blind to the ways that the popular big games that have been around for decades already take away player consent. They just take away player consent in ways that we're used to. So they, like, for instance, if you say, I'm going to hit the goblin with my sword, the GM says you roll a dice, and then the GM tells you what happens, right? That's a normal thing. That bit where the GM tells you what happens is a violation of player consent. That bit where you walk into a room and you say what's in it, and the GM tells you what's in it, that's not player consent, right? It's not about the player not having or having consent. It's about where they have it, right? Um, so what I'm trying to do is play around with this by
Mm.
taking away things that would normally just be under the GM control and putting them under the player's control, and vice versa, and putting and spreading it out, which is not a new thing. I'm not. That's a thing that other games do, but I haven't seen that many games that give you this level of authority over what other players can be and are. And that's again why there's this two-layer thing of the actor and the character, because when with the character, by depersonalizing it, you make players less protective, right? So you give them that extra layer of protection. You can't tell me who my actor is. This is a more constant thing that I have more control over. But my character that I play when they enter the film world, that's a temporary thing. They can die, they can be revealed to be a monster, and then at the end of the film they just go away and you get a new character. It can still inform the actor, and it can still be part of emotional play and narrative play. But by depersonalizing it, you're giving players that space to be more comfortable with with letting go of control.
Mm. Yeah. A lot of good points there to like jump
Yeah,
on
sorry,
there.
I am a rambler and I go from tangent to tangent, and I do apologize about that.
Hmm. I guess like first thing, like going back to what you were saying, in terms of like getting people to try the stuff out. Again, I think you and I are cut from the same cloth in terms of like being interested in games. Like as someone who covers so many games here with Game Wisdom, like I get games sent to me on a weekly basis, so I'm up for like trying anything and everything, and has really been, I think, fantastic at broadening my own approach to game design or game design
Mm,
theory, and
mm,
just being able to see more interesting things out there.
mm.
Like right now as we're recording this, I found this really amazing indie horror game that's like 24, maybe now it's up to 25 reviews on Steam that I've been talking about on social media that I've been loving. And again, like there are
What's it called?
people. It's called Touch Noir, Tachnore,
Okay,
and it
I don't
is
know.
yeah. I think most people don't know about it, and
Sure.
like as you're describing, or you're talking about like people who wouldn't try something. That I think has been just like a universal challenge when it comes to like
Yeah,
anything that's like game related. That if the person doesn't immediately, you know, checks the box that they're interested in, they're not
right,
going to dive into it. And
right.
it is like a very frustrating disconnect because, again, like I play just about any game that comes through my inbox, and I just love that idea. And I've always said like I am as far removed from the general consumer these days, I think, as one can get. But it is, I think, that kind of challenge when it comes to all aspects of game dev that if you're designing a game like with a video game idea, if you're designing a first person shooter, you know there are going to be FPS fans who are going to try that game out. If it's going to be ultra violent, not so violent, cartoony, whatever. If you
Mm,
try to say, let's make a game about a first person shooter that, here's, I think, a really good example because someone I was just telling my friend about. We want to see more FPSs dealing with like 19th century weapons, like very more slower, like kind of
right.
like Civil War, Revolutionary War, that era. That would
Yeah,
sound something amazing for me. I'm sure there's people out there who are interested in it. But I'm sure if you go to the general market, the people who only play a Call of Duty or a Doom or whatever, They're going to look
Right.
at you like, what the hell is wrong with you? Why would you want to play a game where it takes, 40 seconds to fire a gun or 30 seconds to reload?
Hmm.
But there is possibly an audience for that. And is
Yeah,
that kind of
there
challenge?
is. Yeah, this is like a I think this has always been something of an issue, right? Because I think like people broadly speaking aren't very good, and I'm not saying I'm universally exempt to this. People aren't necessarily very good at knowing why they like things, and people often glom on to something that's more of a superficial aspect and be like, "That's why that's the thing I like," right? So, and I think and I think this has kind of been exacerbated over the last 15 years by the development of fandom culture as like a mainstream thing, because it's kind of put people into these little fandom boxes, and they're like, "Well, I like 40K because there's cool guns and the Space Marine men yell and kill aliens and stuff." And like, yeah, I'm sure. Like, I'm not saying that those like kind of surface level things aren't things that you attach to and like. I've got aesthetics and superficial things that I love. I'm just a big Wild West fan in general. Like, I'm a sucker for Wild West stuff. But I think on a deeper level, that's not necessarily why you're continuing to engage with it. And I think that there's like, for instance, like just because I just finished watching Better Call Saul and then doing a Breaking Bad rewatch. Um, I think, for instance, someone who's really into Breaking Bad would probably really like revisionist westerns if they hadn't seen them before, because a lot of the narrative bones of Breaking Bad is in kind of the Western genre. Um, and I think the same could be true of like uh, same true of games, and I think that it's hard. I think it's harder than ever to get people to break out of that
Mm,
niche of their niche, and it's a shame because we're probably living in the best era ever for distributing weird, interesting, creative niche stuff. But it's harder than ever to get people to look at it.
yeah, and I think part of that again is kind of like the rise of like YouTuber and Twitch culture surrounding how people digest games and what games people are covering. I think a really good example would be something like Fear and Hunger. That
Mm.
Fear and Hunger was a game that again we were talking 10 years ago, maybe even 15. It probably would have never even been like mentioned, like just like a game
Right.
around like those taboo topics, no one would be discussing. And it took a lot. It took so much word of mouth to get that game like noticed. Now there are like multiple streamers covering that game, covering RPG makers and so on. That it has really kind of like pushed things forward in that respect. But
Mm.
it always feels like kind of like pulling teeth sometimes to get someone to try something new or try something different. And
Yeah. Sorry.
I was going to
No, I
say,
was just gonna Fear and Hunger is a really good
yeah,
example because I think it's an interesting example of this phenomenon where it went like I got opinions on Fear and Hunger. I think it's really interesting in some ways and kind of less interesting than it's
hmm
credited for in other ways. But aside from that, like it went unnoticed for ages,
yeah,
and then when it was noticed, it people picked up on it and they picked up on things like it, but they're not what they're picking up on isn't the broad idea that interesting creative things are happening in small game design
hmm
spaces. It's games that look and sound and act like this specifically are worthy of attention. And that's
hmm
partly a consequence of how like an algorithm the nature of the algorithm and the way everything in our lives is driven by algorithm is also informed by this because it's like you like this, here's something like it, but the thing that's like it is like it only in the least interesting ways, right?
yeah.
And how many games have you played where it's like it's so obviously inspired by something else but it's got none of the juice. It's nowhere near as good because it's aping the aesthetics and the game design. It's not understanding the deeper level of what it's doing. And also, this isn't a problem with creatives necessarily either, because like I don't think, especially in video games, I think a lot of creatives aren't okay. So I come from like I'm good. What I'm going to say I'm trying very hard not to make it sound insulting because I don't mean it to be, but I come from like a humanities background, not a technical background. Like I studied a lot of English literature, and my degree is in history, and I've always been very personally fascinated by literature and film and theater. So that's kind of my background. And the thing is that a lot of people who work in video game design don't have that vocabulary. And this isn't because they're stupid, they're not. It's because they just don't have that training. So often they'll be like, well, let's do this thing because games like this do this thing. And they're not necessarily thinking about the fact that form follows function and stuff, right? So like and they might just put stuff in and just because it's cool, and that's fine. That's a fine thing to do. But if your whole game is just stuff that you think it's cool, you end up with kind of a bit of a surface level experience, right?
Hmm.
But like, I think it's difficult because it's like with Fear and Hunger, it's like, you know, that meme of like the conveyor line where it's like the guy going, "Oh, I guess we're making green triangles now." It's like the content algorithm going, "Oh, I guess we're doing like super difficult, edgy RPG Maker games now." It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
but like learn from this that there's gold in the foothills, right? Like if you look for them, there's gold there.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, but what can you do? What can you do about this other than learn how to pitch your game in such a way that it's that people overcome that resistance?
Hmm. Yep. And like, as you're talking about like games being inspired by other games, just like copying like the vibe, without understanding what makes it work.
Mhm.
Again, like
Yeah,
the bullet heaven genre that we mentioned earlier, like again, like for people who are listening, like I have played so many, many examples of it. And
mm,
I think only count on maybe like one hand the bullet heavens that feel legitimately different from Vampire
right,
Survivors. That I can honestly say that playing this game is not just playing Vampire Survivors, but with whatever. And
right.
it's that kind of challenge. And like to the point of Fear and Hunger, that I am sure as we're sitting here recording this that we're going to be seeing developers again copy kind of like the extreme aspect of what made Fear and Hunger work. Again, stuff that
Right.
we can't obviously mention here on YouTube without them throwing a fit. But
Yes.
again, it doesn't really, I think, expand on that, and that's of course like a major shame. Like I want to see more games do interesting things. Look
Yeah.
outside that kind of blew up as well last year, and like they're still updating it right now. Like that, I
Right.
think is just a phenomenal game, and I remember playing
It's
the
actually I just got it. I just haven't played it yet, but it's on my list.
yeah,
Sorry, carry on.
I remember playing the original Game Jam build for this. This was like 2 years for a launch, or maybe like a year.
Mm,
I remember sitting there going, this is going to be a damn good game. Like just playing that original build. And I've had that kind of luck to be able to be like able to play some of these games before they get picked up. Slay the Spire. I played that like 6 months before it started getting coverage on major sites.
mm,
And it's great to do that, but the problem is like it's like very rare I think for like myself to be able to just say I really like this game and I push that game to be this massive success. I've written and covered so many indie games that have had less than 20 reviews, less than 10 reviews on Steam
mm.
sometimes. And I can gush about these games again all day long, but even if I say it's a really great game, I just don't know, like, is the consumer going to make that leap to say, what if we want to play a first person shooter that's not about shooting? Or
Mm.
a game that does something completely different with a roguelike or, some other example? And
Yeah.
it's just very hard to find an answer to that.
Well, something I think that you mentioned about Fear and Hunger and people kind of picking the wrong things for it, like, because I think Fear and Hunger is a really interesting example because for as much as it's hailed by some as a kind of very innovative thing, it's actually more of a callback game, right? It's a
Mhm.
throwback game. It's Rogue essentially. It's Rogue but edgier, and I think the things that it does that are interesting to me is it understands and plays with the narrative power of impermanence Um, I don't think a lot of the edgy stuff is necessary. I'm not. I don't have a problem with it as someone making a game that currently that definitely like it's not well because it's a TTRPG. How much you include is ultimately up to you. But it's designed to incorporate like kind of more extreme themes because I think that's a thing that can be valuable in fiction. But I also think that in terms of that edgy content, I think it's hit and miss. I think some of it worked really well, and some of it's just kind of a bit puerile, I guess. But like what works about that game is that it's putting players in a position that they maybe haven't experienced because they haven't played the games 30, 40 years ago where that was more common. Like things like Look Outside, which Look Outside is like I think it's doing something quite I haven't played it yet, so I can't speak for its game design, but just visually, it's doing the kind of similar thing that Undertale did of kind of reminding people what was good about like Earthbound style RPGs via kind of, just kind of tricking, like, oh, remember this? We're just gonna add and it's yoink and twist in like the good way. Like I'll say that I think that if I could identify like one thing that I think would make video games in general and TTRPGs, just media in general, more interesting is if more creatives had a varied diet. And I don't mean they're eating their fruits and veg. I mean there's way too many people in video games who just play video games. And they maybe watch films, they maybe read books, but they don't really learn about them. Like they just, the thing that they're interested in learning about and deep diving on is video games. They
Mhm.
read books about video game design, they watch videos about video game design, they play video games. But the thing is, a lot of the people who made like some of the great best video games were inspired by other things or the best anything, right? Like, and I think there's real value in looking at different mediums and saying, how do they elicit this emotional reaction or this experience? And how can I translate that into my medium? Because something I'm doing with my game is trying to replicate that feeling of mistrust, uncertainty, lack of control, sometimes nonsensical plot twists. How do you make a murder mystery in which no planning is not only recommended but ideal because it's best if the plot is kind of a little all over the place and extremist and weird, right? Like how do you translate that? How do you translate that feeling? And I think knowing how to translate it, first you need to understand what it's doing and how it's doing it. So like I know it seems like a big ask, like, oh, just get really into this, but just like in your free time, instead of playing 3 hours playing video games, spend like 2 hours playing video games and watch a film and then read some critical analysis of it because it's not hard to find. Um, I think that having that breadth of experience, it just creates people who are not just bringing in stuff that is unique, but thinking about things and designing about things in ways that
Mhm.
they wouldn't have before because they were constrained by what's done in the genre.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's that time again. We actually went very long, despite this being a very late night cast for me. And I'll be posting the second part of this in the next few days. Be sure to check out the links from Laurence down below, do all the YouTubing stuff. And as always, if you are a developer working on a game you'd like to come on and chat about, be sure to get in touch. With that, have a great rest of your night, and come back for part 2 coming soon.